So epithelial tissue is often involved in secreting things. So can you think of some examples? You know that epithelial tissue is on the surface of your skin, right? So we secrete some stuff from our skin. In fact, we have a special name for the epithelial cells that are involved in secreting things and called granular epithelial tissue. Okay, and this can happen in two different ways. The granular epithelial tissue can release or secrete substances directly into the blood, or it can have a little tube, and then from the tube it can secrete things to some sort of an apical surface of the epithelium. So it will secrete it to the surface of the skin, or it can secrete it to the lumen, or those hollow spaces in your stomach, intestines that are lining, right? The apical surfaces that are lining those kinds of spaces. So endocrine, she's so cute, right? Endocrine glands are glands that release products directly into the blood. And the products that are released into the blood are called hormones. So if something's released directly into the blood, it's called a hormone. And these glands are part of the structures: thymus, thyroid, pituitary gland. Okay. Now, exocrine glands are the glands that use some sort of a duct to release their products onto the apical surface of epithelial tissue. So sweat glands, oil glands, digestive enzymes, tears, milk, your earwax, all those are exocrine glands. Okay, so this just has to do with the method of secretion, with a duct or no, and does it go directly into the blood? Then it's endocrine. Doesn't go into the blood, then it's exocrine. All right, we're going to have Esty here. Esty, you want to say hi? We're going to have Esty here with us for a little bit. Exocrine glands secrete products that enter ducts, right? A duct is like a tube, and then that tube goes to the apical surface of that epithelial tissue, and then the product, the stuff that you're secreting, is then expunged onto the apical surface of the top layer of the epithelial cells. So this can be to the surface of the skin, or it can be to the surface of the stomach lining, or to the surface of an intestine, right? Those are also apical surfaces. Here we have a sample of human hairy skin. It's showing us a sebaceous gland, right, where it produces sebum or oil. And here it's showing a sudoriferous gland, which is just a sweat gland, like your regular sweat. And if we zoom in to this sweat gland, you see that this hole is the lumen. That's the inside of the tube, or inside of the duct. And lining the duct, we have cuboidal epithelial cells. And depending where you are in the duct, some places have 2 layers of cuboidal epithelium and some places have 1 layer of epithelium. So here I would say, get my pointer, It's pretty clearly only one layer of epithelium. Here it is harder to tell, but also we got to remember that we're looking at the top of the tube and there are cells underneath it making up the lower parts of the duct, which can be coming through in this particular sample. Okay, so that's an example of exocrine gland. We have epithelial cells that function in secretion. So we call it a secretory cell. It has a basal layer. And here, the side of the cell that is facing the lumen or the hollow space is the apical membrane, or the apical side of the tissue and of the cell. Okay, and here we're pointing out to the duct. All right, continuing on with exocrine glands, right? This is stuff that goes to the surface, not in the blood. Exocrine glands can release their components in 3 different ways. So there are 3 modes of secretion. Ecrine, which is also called merocrine mode of secretion, apocrine mode of secretion, and holocrine mode of secretion. Now let's look at what the difference is. By far the most common type of exocrine secretion is the ecrine or merocrine secretion. In this type of secretion, these epithelial cells that are also secretory cells, they produce inside of them a bunch of product. So whatever it is that we're going to secrete, like let's say it's sweat, produce them, and they package that product into secretory vesicles. So little balls of plasma membrane that have that product inside. And then they exocytose those secretory, the contents of those secretory vesicles, and so the stuff goes into the duct by exocytosis. Right? This is going to be true for our sweat glands, salivary glands, lacrimal glands, right, for your tears, gastric glands, stomach juices, and pancreatic glands. This is very, very common type. Merocrine or ecrine use exocytosis. Apocrine mode of secretion for exocrine glands is much less common. Much less common. And what happens is that the cell produces a bunch of the product, moves it to the apical side of the cell, and then that whole apical side of the cell breaks away and breaks down. And now the cells have to regrow in order to remake that product and become full-sized again. Okay, so again, we have vesicles, but instead of exocytosing, the whole apical side of the gland cell breaks apart. So think that apocrine is the apical side of the cell is broken down. The example for this is the mammary glands and how we produce the milk that the babies suckle. And lastly, the holocrine mode of secretion is where these epithelial secretory cells produce a bunch of product. They pack them into vesicles, once again, same as all the others. But then once they're completely packed with vesicles, the entire cell breaks apart. Destruction of the cell. So in order to get all of that material out that you've just created and put into vesicles, you break down the whole cell. Okay. This is sustainable only because there are cells at the basal membrane. So the very bottom side of the tissue has cells that are able to go through mitosis quickly and replenish the cells that have been destroyed for the purpose of secretion. The one common example of this is the sebaceous glands of skin that produce sebum, the oil that keeps our skin nice and moist and shiny and protects us from invasion of foreign materials. Okay, here is another slide comparing the three modes and giving it to you visually. Again, merocrine secretion, also called eccrine secretion, is the most common, and it's just exocytosis. So these cells right here, they are epithelial cells, but they're also secretory cells because they're epithelial cells that secrete stuff. This is their apical side of the cells into the lumen or the hollow space of the duct. This is the basal side of the cells, and it's connected there to some connective tissue by the basal membrane. The apocrine gland, the apex, the top part of the cells, get destroyed or ripped out in order to secrete the product. And holocrine is when the entire cell breaks down, but you have new cells regenerating. And so if you look at holocrine glands, for example, your sebaceous gland in the skin, you will see that there are several layers of cells, and that's necessary because the bottom layer always has to be intact and not being broken down, and only the top layers of that tissue are just being destroyed during the secretion process. There are places, especially in your digestive tract, where and respiratory tract, where a single cell functions as an exocrine gland. So instead of having many cells creating a duct and producing the stuff, you just have one cell producing the material, for example, mucus, and then it's going to just secrete it to the apical surface of the tissue, and there you go. So it's a modified epithelial cells that has a particular function for manufacturing and secretion of mucus, and those cells are called goblet cells. Okay. So how will you be able to tell these different tissues apart when you're looking at them under the microscope? So this is particularly important in lab, where you will have to look at these microscope slides and identify them with the name of a specific tissue type. So first of all, just to know that this is epithelial tissue, you're looking for empty spaces, right? So, there's definitely a big empty looking space here, probably, maybe. Looks like this is an empty-ish space, maybe. And with experience, you'll be like, yeah, that is an open space. Here's an open space, this white stuff. And then for the rest of the images, it's the top part of the image that is the open space. Everywhere where you have open spaces, you will have epithelial tissue immediately next to that open space, lining it. And it will be the apical side of the epithelial tissue, or the apical side of the topmost layer of epithelial cells that is lining that open space. Here, that tissue lining the open space is really, really, really thin and really, really flat. So that is simple squamous epithelium. This next one is relatively obvious. It looks like a duct, and it has these nicely shaped cuboidal cells with circular nuclei. So this is simple cuboidal epithelium. The side that is facing this open lumen is the apical side. Here you have what it's harder to see because this is a really small image, but you have simple columnar epithelium, and you can tell because the nuclei are very oval, right? The purple nuclei here are oval, and the cell is tall, and the nuclei are kind of mostly all aligned in the same area. Whereas here on the far right, they do look cuboidal. However, the nuclei are really all over the place, and they're like overlapping. And this is pseudostratified epithelium, where all of the cells are attached at the basement membrane. They're all touching that bottom connective tissue part, but they don't all make it to the top, meaning some of them are just shorter and they get crowded out at the top, at the apical end. And this little hairy looking stuff, that is likely cilia structures at the apical side of the cell. The rest of these look like they are stratified. It looks like there are many layers of cells. Let's look at this one to the bottom left and the bottom middle. These are not the bestest images. However, they both have several layers of cells. So we have stratified epithelium. We really in this class only talked about stratified squamous epithelium, and that's what both of these are. But the difference is that the top of this bottom image, the apical side, is really kind of nice and healthy looking. And in the middle image, it's all flaky and like you don't see any nuclei. It's just these weird lines and sheets. That is because these cells are flaking, breaking off, and they are dead, full of keratin. So this middle bottom image is keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium, whereas on the left bottom, it is stratified squamous epithelium that is non-keratinized. On the right-hand side, this is that one weird type of epithelial tissue that has oddly shaped cells, and the apical cells are all kind of balloony shaped. So where do we find this? It's only basically in one place in the body. You remember? You're probably saying stuff or thinking stuff, but I can't hear you. Urinary bladder or ureters. And this type of epithelial tissue is for stretching. And right now it looks like it's not very stretched. And it is called transitional epithelium. Questions here, so I encourage you to pause and answer them. All right, see you next time for connective tissue.